My name is Julia Dillon. I am on the product marketing team at Amplitude. I'm excited to introduce our two speakers today. I'll let Katie introduce herself and Weston introduce himself, but Katie, you go first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Gear, and I oversee acquisition on the growth marketing team here at Amplitude. And my remit includes organic traffic, paid traffic, conversion once users are on the website, as well as conversion through our sign-up flow. So I'm really excited to be here and chat all things acquisition and growth. I'll pass it to Weston.
Thanks, Katie and Julia. Nice to meet everybody. My name's Weston. I'm a PM here at Amplitude, and I lead our growth product team. I previously worked on core products, so everything around the analytics capabilities of Amplitude, and I've since moved over to help create our product-led growth motion. So really excited to chat with everyone here today.
Cool. So we are in good hands in terms of growth experts. And so just to set the stage for everyone and like why we're here and what we're going to cover. As you heard, Katie and Weston are both on our growth product and our growth marketing teams. And growth teams play a super crucial role in helping companies achieve their different growth objectives by using data-driven strategies, experimentation, and a deep understanding of user behavior and market dynamics. And at Amplitude, our growth product and growth marketing teams work really closely together. And Weston and Katie specifically work hand in hand to acquire new users, what Katie said, and then activate them, what Weston said. So today we're going to kind of pull back the curtain and hear from them about how they use Amplitude to improve the Amplitude customer experience from everywhere from before someone becomes a customer, so on our website, to signing up and getting started and sending data into Amplitude. And so we're going to walk through 3 decisions that they have made with data and Amplitude and discuss how they came to these decisions and really look at how those insights helped grow our user base. So hopefully that is interesting to you. And hopefully at the end of this webinar, you walk away with a couple of new ideas for things that you can think about or even go in and implement at your own company. So we're going to get started. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is the industry benchmarks tool. And really fast, I'm going to try to drop this into our chat. 1 second, here we go. Okay, so for everyone who is eager to click on that link, please do. We're going to dive in and ask a couple of questions. So first off, Katie, can you tell everyone what the industry benchmarks tool is?
Yeah, this tool is on our website and it shows benchmark data or like baseline data for a lot of key metrics that other teams might use to track growth and engagement. So we have acquisition metrics, retention metrics, and at a more granular level, these are like new user growth rate, retention rate, engagement rate. All of these benchmarks are aggregated and anonymized from Amplitude data, from customer data, and it's segmentable by industry, company size, and region. And this tool is on our website today and is completely free to interact with and use.
Cool. Yeah, so if anyone is on the tool, I think it's really cool because it is super interactive. So if you're in a specific industry, you can kind of click on the industry and see where you should be stacking up. I guess a follow-up question for you, Katie, is were there any insights that you had uncovered in Amplitude before, or maybe in previous experiences too, that led you to want to build an interactive tool like the product benchmarks tool?
Yeah, this idea for an interactive tool came from looking at the current data on how our website was performing. So when I joined about a year ago, I started to get just baselines of what does our website look like? How many people are engaging with it? How much are they engaging? Who's visiting? And I found a pretty key trend was folks will come to our site and they don't spend a lot of time on the site and they're not visiting a lot of pages. And my instinct there was a lot of our site is doing a lot of telling people what our product is and showing screenshots, but we're not giving people a lot of opportunity to engage with the website, to interact and actually see what the product looks like and really like play with it. So looking at metrics like pages per session was pretty low for our site, and our retention rate was pretty low. Only about 10% of users were coming back after their first day. I started to look into ideas for more interactive content we could put on the website so people could actually do more than just look at images and read text on our website and get a bit more value. And so that's what brought me to this benchmarks idea as the first thing we would build. But benchmarks certainly was not my idea first. I think this concept of having product benchmarks has been at the company and has been an idea for a long time.
Yeah, I feel like every company I've worked at has like tried to build something similar to this, but it does help to have the behavioral data kind of at our fingertips to actually use it. Another, thing I think that is cool here is like for any customers or prospects or people who are just kind of wondering about like what the key benchmarks are that they should be tracking. This is a nice guide. And Weston, I guess I'm curious from you, could you talk a little bit more about the metrics that we chose to show in the tool and why we landed on those as benchmarks for the industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think like Katie mentioned, this was actually something that had come about via customer research and customer feedback on many occasions. And we ultimately had a few hypotheses that we worked around to ship this bet. And so we were trying to answer questions like, do benchmarks help orient users on what is good, right? At what point in a customer's workflow are benchmarks actually helpful? How much does, for example, the quality or relevance of a benchmark matter? And then lastly, do users actually kind of use these benchmarks on an ongoing basis, or do they really just use them like to set something up and then they move on? And so by asking ourselves some of those questions to like help identify exactly what problems we were solving, we ultimately landed on metrics that we felt gave a pretty kind of holistic view of a user journey, and you can kind of abstract these ultimately to almost any customer journey. And that was like a really important outcome for us, was that these weren't maybe too specific to an Amplitude context and could be contextualized by industry or, for example, by kind of product or region. And so ultimately, acquisition, activation, engagement, and retention are kind of the four we landed on. And it was really, to do kind of, 2 or 3 things at the end of the day. One, first and foremost, are these like abstract and general enough that everyone can derive value of them and compare them to something that they look at when they look at their funnel? 2 was, given what we had heard from customers and the feedback we'd gotten that I mentioned before, which ones ultimately kind of rose to the top in terms of requests? And then lastly, to those hypotheses I mentioned earlier around like, when is this helpful? What kind of benchmarks do we think people could keep coming back to, right? So we didn't want to focus, for example, too top of funnel so that it was only relevant on, day one, or kind of like at the end of the funnel so the retention maybe was the only thing. So I was really trying to make these benchmarks super helpful on an ongoing basis.
So another big question, and I feel like I even had this question just as an internal member of the Amplitude team, but getting a tool like this out the door takes so much work, and there's so much collaboration between product and also marketing. And so I'm wondering if you all could talk a little more about the collaboration process between your teams when you developed this tool.
Yeah, I think the collaboration really started even on deciding to build this. There's always a question of why now? Why build this instead of something else? And I think bringing together, like Weston said, we had heard customer feedback about wanting something like this forever, and we knew this was something we probably wanted to have in the product. But building this at a scale in the product is a much bigger project than standing up a tool like this on the website. So I think being able to bring in the acquisition angle from the marketing side helped make this be a really viable first project. we can stand this up faster on the website, get a sense of which metrics users are interested in, which industries they're interested in. The product team can learn from this. We can get traffic and hopefully a couple signups and customers. I think beyond just even getting it greenlit, the collaboration was extensive in figuring out how to develop which metrics would be meaningful. Weston has so much deep product experience in Amplitude. He's able to bring in knowledge about which charts we could start with and vet, how to cut some of these metrics in a way I didn't know as well. And I brought in a lot of the SEO angle. Okay, we're building these pages on the website. How do we make sure they're accessible, they're going to potentially rank, they're usable? The original design was done by product design, but then reviewed by design folks from the marketing side. I think generally there's a lot of buy-in on standing this up as a new feature because it was easier to build this on the site rather than if the marketing team were pushing for this to be a new feature in the product. That is still on our roadmap, but it was easier to get this greenlit and shipped, having it be almost more of, for the product team, almost like a test balloon on the site. For me, great, it's an interactive tool that I can use to drive acquisition. So because I think it was such a win-win there in terms of learning and demand, it was easy for us to collaborate each step of the way, even if our goals are slightly different at each step about what we wanted to learn or what we wanted to gain.
Yeah, it sounds like you really got to like hit two birds with one stone, which made it easier to get buy-in and work on everything together. But the final question for this one is, were there any initial insights or findings from the benchmark data that have surprised you? Maybe that's like feedback from customers or exciting stats that are coming in from the website. I would love to know what's the initial take.
Yeah, some of the things we were most excited to learn about was which industries would be most engaged with as a filter, and for the different types of metrics we have, which category would be most clicked on and engaged with. And I was actually surprised to see, so acquisition is the number one viewed metric type, but it's the first one. So I look at that with a grain of salt, but actually seeing that retention was the most actively clicked metric type after acquisition is surprising since it's at the bottom, but that gives us a sense of, oh, more people are interested in retention as a metric versus activation or engagement. The numbers are close, but that was surprising. The most surprising data point in terms of industries engaged with is that education is the top industry filter used out of our full list of industries. That's really surprising to me. I think as Amplitude, we think of a lot of our customers and our users as very tech forward. They're SaaS, they're B2B, even if they're not that, maybe they're fintech or media. And seeing that education was the top filter was certainly a surprise to me.
First section complete. We're going to move on to the next one. And I think this one is like very interesting because I feel like experimentation is kind of the hot topic among growth teams and also seemingly every team that I talk to. Many of you on the call probably leverage experimentation or A/B testing to try to uncover like what the most effective growth levers are for your business. And the teams at Amplitude use our native experimentation capabilities to run controlled experiments regularly, and we learn a lot from the process every single time. And so today we're going to dive into an area that is near and dear to growth teams. I feel like constant improvement is a big growth mindset kind of thing. So we're going to be talking about experimentation and what you can learn from the experiments that don't necessarily go the way that you thought that they would. So first up, we've got, an inside look at a chart, a journey chart in Amplitude. And Weston, I'll hand it over to you. What was the initial problem area of the product that you wanted to improve with this experiment? And then also, what were the changes or the updates that you rolled out?
Sure. I'll maybe just start with the problem area and then pass it over to Katie, since she really ended up getting in the weeds and kind of owning what customers see today. So that's also been, I guess, a great example of the partnership. But ultimately, what led us to kind of prioritize work on our sign-up flow, is the fact that we have drop-off and a number of confusing experiences in that kind of end-to-end workflow of signing up for Amplitude. If there are, other folks here on the call who work in growth, it's no surprise that the sign-up flow is a constant, area of scrutiny in the product, just because it is so high leverage. At the end of the day, right, if you're able to increase the conversion rates in that top of funnel, it has so much impact on subsequent metrics that ultimately drive end business outcomes, right? It's solving the colloquial leaky bucket problem. And so what we wanted to do here was really increase the sign-up rate from our website, amplitude.com, to creating an organization. And we were really trying to go after a few problems that we identified. The first was that there were basically just some really confusing experiences in the sign-up flow with respect to some of the kind of options that customers had. So, for example, discoverability of our EU data center, if you're wanting to have your data in EU, or choosing certain org settings. Another one was basically simply getting users through the kind of flow in its entirety, and getting to the point where an actual org is created such that other people can join it. And then last but not least is just setting the right expectations in the flow. We had a lot of customer research that showed us that at certain points in the flow where we thought of those opportunities as education moments and moments to better set expectations, we were actually missing the mark in ways that ultimately led users to question kind of subsequent steps in their initial journey. So those were some of the problems we were trying to solve ultimately at the end of the day, so that we can increase the rate of organizations signing up for Amplitude. And on that note, maybe I'll just pass it over to Katie to chat about what we did, and maybe even some of the kind of key metrics and indicators that she was looking into specifically here.
When we started working on this, actually go back to the previous chart, it's still a great example. For context, Weston and my teams were working on this together, and no one had taken any stabs at improving the sign-up flow for a long time. So both of our teams came into this very confident and made some big swings here. So this chart, I think, is a great example of one of the more data-backed improvements we made. This journey chart shows the top two paths. This is on one step in our sign-up flow. There are a few required fields. And the first one here is team, that everyone has to fill out team. And then you have to fill out company size. But this bottom row here shows an additional field in green, the second one, for country. This is actually an optional field on this flow, and we could see with our own journey charts that folks who were choosing to complete this country field were less likely to actually get to the next step in the sign-up flow. And so we had data showing we are showing an optional field, and it is actually distracting users and making them less likely to advance. So this is an example of one of the high confidence improvements. We knew we could get rid of some of these fields, streamline this, and make this simpler. But because it had been so long since we had taken any stab at the sign-up flow, we went even bigger. We also had some conviction around making the whole sign-up flow more branded and trying to communicate Amplitude's brand experience and things like that throughout the flow as well. So with the variant that we tried in Q2, Q3, we also added more illustrations, more Amplitude branding into the sign-up flow, in addition to reducing friction and reordering steps. So we made a lot of changes at once in this pass, which we will touch on in just a moment.
It's so interesting to just see the specific journeys, and also hearing your intel and kind of background is very helpful. Okay, so do you want to talk a little bit about this chart and what we're looking at?
Yeah, I'll set some context here. So we launched this test, we got it out into the field, and fairly early on at a high level, which is not what this chart shows, this is an example, but at a high level, we could already see that sign-up rate for the variant was not outperforming the control. We were not getting a higher rate of signups that we cared about. Fewer users were making it through the sign-up flow. Weston's team and my team care a lot about statistical significance. And so we said, okay, we'll keep watching this test. We'll let it gain more volume to give us truer results. But pretty early on, we could tell that the big swing we had taken was not successful. So we used those high-level key metrics, really our primary metrics, to understand whether or not the test overall was successful. But then also for each step of the flow, we built charts to help understand step by step, step 1 to 2, step 2 to 3, were we getting folks through the flow? Because we had made so many changes, it was important to look at each step and understand if we were making a difference. So this chart is a good example for our first step of the flow, the first screen users saw. We had a hypothesis that showing a video on this sign-up screen that folks could click on would help people understand the Amplitude brand. I believe this was a fairly controversial decision during design. We weren't sure if we wanted a video or not. And we were not sure whether or not the video would be helpful or distracting. So this is a funnel chart in Amplitude, and this is using one of my favorite features, which is making this second step optional to understand for users who took this step, were they more likely to convert to the third step I really care about? And then if users didn't take this step, how did that change their conversion? And from this chart, you can see for users who played the video that was on the first screen of our sign-up flow, they were far less likely to convert and actually make it to step 2. And so this nullified the hypothesis that the video would help users and confirmed the suspicion that this was actually a distracting feature. So this is an example more in the weeds of experiment analysis of how we could tell that some of the changes we had implemented at a more granular level were hurting rather than helping users sign up for our product.
Yeah. It sounds like there were so many moving parts to this experiment, like so much enthusiasm from 2 teams who hadn't tackled this, sign up flow for a long time, and probably a lot of ideas and a lot of things that were put into motion. What did the analysis of this test teach you about experiment setup and experiment design?
And as we've returned to improving the sign-up flow, we are taking smaller steps and working more iteratively. There always has to be a balance there. You can't A/B test every single pixel change for 4 weeks to reach statistical significance. You have to find the right balance of impactful changes that you can test. But we're taking a much more isolated and smaller approach to the changes that we're now testing again. One thing that was interesting in looking in the results for this test at a high level was even though all up, we didn't increase the sign-up rate in the flow, there were steps where we could see that changes we had made were improving conversion from, say, step 4 to 5. So there were improvements we had made in this test that were helping at a lower level. And so what we did was document everything that we knew was working from this test, even though the overall batch of changes did not work. And those are the first changes that we are reintroducing into the sign-up flow. So the example using the journeys chart from before of removing the optional country field, we're taking that out again. That was a pretty high confidence change we'd made, and we want to make sure that we are rolling forward with that. But yes, we are taking smaller bites in, especially a very complex flow like this.
Yeah, I think the final question here is, if you had to give a piece of advice to a team that was running experiments for the first time, what would your advice be? Would it be different from what you just said?
Yeah, I do think for folks who are first getting into experimentation, I truly believe that 98% of good experimentation is thoughtful experiment design and setup. And so what I've told a lot of people who are starting out with A/B testing to start is spend more time thinking about what you're changing and why, and then how you think you would know, and be able to track you're successful. And starting from that, I see a lot of A/B testers start with, I want to move clicks up. Okay, I think I could do this, I could do this, I could do this to improve clicks, versus starting with, we think the sign-up flow has a lot of friction. We hypothesize that removing steps or removing fields will reduce friction. Okay, how would we track if we have reduced friction? And going at it from that approach, it takes a little longer, but that really, really reduces the analysis paralysis you can get when you're seeing A/B test results. And especially in Amplitude, you can look at metrics for anything in an experiment. You could cut the data a million different ways. And so it's really helpful to keep yourself honest about what are the metrics you're looking at and what is your hypothesis. Weston, I'm curious for your advice for first-time experimenters as well.
I think that's like an excellent point. I think I totally agree with everything you said. I think the only other thing I might mention is just having, I guess, like some like understanding of the cost of experimentation too. I think like a lot of teams think like, oh wow, like experimentation, like ABs, like that's the hot new thing to do. And like everyone wants to bring that rigor to, data-driven decision makings and have the evidence of whether or not something can prove the metric or not. But there are costs to experimentation. Like here's an example where we were set back like weeks. Obviously, we learned a bunch of stuff and we're applying those learnings now in subsequent iterations of the sign-up flow. But setting up a treatment or like a multivariate treatment for an experiment, letting an experiment run its course, doing the analysis, like it takes time and it takes investment. And so there is an investment decision. I think that is actually like something that goes unsaid oftentimes when teams throw around the idea of experimentation. And I think you ultimately just have to be asking yourself, like, what is like the reason for experimenting here? Is it that like it's such a like critical surface area that if we make a mistake, we actually will hurt other metrics like unintentionally and we can't afford to make that mistake? Is it that we have never touched this area before and we want like really good quant signal to be able to like subsequently kind of pattern match for other things, or envelope, I get a sense of like the back of the envelope for other opportunities. So yeah, I guess like the long story short of what I'm trying to say is like, don't just experiment for the sake of experimenting. Like you really do need to think about the cost of experimentation too, and like ultimately like what it is you're trying to learn. I think it's super important.
Cool. Okay, we're gonna move on to the third topic, which is onboarding and activation, which we kind of just delved into a little bit, dipped our toes into, but now we'll like really dive in. Getting started is obviously the hardest part for everything, and I feel like especially in product, and there are so many different opportunities for areas of improvement. So Weston, I guess the first question for you is like, what were the data points that you were looking at when you were deciding how to make changes to onboarding and activation for our users?
Yeah, thank you for prompting this one. This is something that obviously I think about all the time. We've just done a ton of research to understand which few first steps in the product are really our best leading indicators of success. And so we did testing on candidates that we had presumptions were strong signals. So for example, as a team, you can brainstorm like, what is it that I think someone should be doing in the product, right? Like sharing content for the first time, or the rate of like net new user growth in an organization, for example. And ultimately, when we looked at all those candidates and kind of just back tested against organizations who ultimately did succeed and didn't, and kind of saw which of these things were common to our success cases, we found that the best leading indicator of subsequent retention and success was saving your first chart within 7 days of sign up. So that means basically once you've created your organization, you're pretty quickly getting data in and trying to define something that like subsequently you might be able to share or show somebody. And so this metric ultimately did two things exceptionally well for us. First, it's a super actionable activation metric and goal for us to move, right? It's super clearly time bound and it's a clear outcome. We can say, all right, is it that we want people to be saving a chart on day one rather than day 3? Or are people doing other activities that aren't saving charts and we want to actually course correct, right? Super, super clear. The second one is that it correlates exceptionally well with the subsequent kind of habit formation that we're looking for. And as an added plus, this kind of metric has great coverage, since all orgs who ultimately succeed at adoption have to go through the step of saving a chart, whereas maybe some other metrics are just maybe one of many paths. And if organizations who do end up saving the first chart, most of them do it in their first week. So it's actually a really good metric for us to look at the existing population of organizations that sign up. So we'll go through a couple slides actually now. The biggest drop off before getting to the point of being able to save a chart after you've signed up is getting data into your organization. So thank you for going to the next slide, Julia. This is like the first basically step that you'll see once you're in the product. We ask you a couple of questions about whether or not you have access to your code base to get data in. And then we try to help organizations solve this cold start problem, or blank page syndrome that they're encountered with. There's a ton of self-service and startup users that I've spoken to who really just are in this kind of analysis paralysis mode of not being sure how to go about starting with data. So if you're not familiar with product analytics because you haven't come from a tool like Google Analytics or Heap or Mixpanel or have used Amplitude in a previous role, then you might not be familiar with event-based analytics in and of themselves. So you might be thinking, all right, how do I use the existing data I have in a warehouse or elsewhere in Amplitude? And here's an example where to solve that problem, we spoke with customers and asked them what kind of information and prompts do you want? And they effectively told us that they want events that are relevant to them and their industry. So on this page here that we call industry recommended events, you can choose from a list of about half a dozen industries from B2B SaaS to education to gaming. And then we prompt you with a list of up to 4 events that can really just help you construct the first funnel that would be helpful for you to get started. And on this screen, we also prompt you to invite an engineer if you don't have access to your code base or a non-technical, because it's just so important at this point that we give the user a really clear call to action. And on this page, the call to action is quite literally, you need these events, get them into your product. This is going to be step 1 to being on the right path forward. The second step here, which is the send your data step, as you can see on the left-hand side, we iterate through that checklist. We have started building out an ecosystem of all the options we think are super relevant for organizations to get their data in. So you might have really, really high maturity organizations with centrally managed and governed and federated data with like a CDP. But then on the flip side, you might have some other organizations who are starting really net new. And so there are options for technical users on this page, like using one of our SDKs, and then options that we've started to more recently build out, which are kind of low, no-code options. And so you have things like uploading events via a CSV here, or mocking events via the Chrome extension tool that you can turn on within your web page and generate events. These basically range of data sources have really let us help users across like the spectrum of technical to non-technical get data into their product. So we've really kind of helped solve over the past quarter the problem of non-technical users not even being able to almost like demo the product with their own data. And this really helps unblock kind of this step, which is super critical for getting data in. As I mentioned, historically, this has been like the biggest drop off between sign up to saving that first chart.
I
And
feel like as a non-technical user, when I saw all of this, I was like, wow, this makes so much more sense. This is so clear, and like it's nice to have the direction. So it's interesting that you had figured out that like this is the big drop-off point and that this is the outcome.
Mm-hmm. And we're doing more and more to like help customize this experience. As you can see here, all of them are on one screen, and then you can go into the catalog. But subsequent iterations are going to really help customize the experience such that if you do identify as a non-technical user, will help you choose exactly the right data source for you. And on the flip side, if you are technical and you're coming from a mobile platform, then we can be really clear about like, here's our iOS or Android SDKs.
Yeah. Continuing on to the theme of non-technical users and like making sure that everything is simplified, do you want to walk through this slide too?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on this slide with these 2 screenshots, and I'll voice over what they are, but this is actually the point that I want to leave everybody with when it comes to activation. Ultimately, when you're building a self-service motion, in the same way as sales-led motions think about growth, you're really just trying to reduce time to value. That is like the biggest thing when you're thinking about customer problems to solve that you should be laser focused on. What is your time to value? How do you reduce it? How do you reduce the friction? How do you ultimately get users to that outcome that you've identified more quickly, more effectively, and set them off for subsequent success, habit formation, everything down the line? And so what you're seeing on this slide on the top left are the 4 templates that we built that we show people once they get data in. And it's really templates built off of dozens of research calls with startups and even VCs who are asking their portfolio companies for basically status checks, right? And monthly updates or whatnot. So we have templates here designed to capture user activity, conversion analysis, feature adoption, session engagement, and we have a few others also. I've just kind of picked the top 4 here. And that's the last step of the onboarding checklist. We prompt someone to click into one of those. And then on the right-hand side here, you'll see an example of this template that pops up with either demo data because you're in onboarding, or the data that you've just uploaded using one of the data sources. And so this really just comes back to that notion of identify the customer problem in the onboarding and activation flow, which has historically been get data in and time to value, and then speak to customers to help solve and connect the dots. And that's that's the kind, the end of the activation onboarding flow here that we've really seen help move the needle for us.
Okay, amazing. Thank you all so much for coming to this webinar. I hope you really enjoyed it. So really appreciate you all attending and hope that you all have a great, wonderful day. And we'll see you around. Bye.